Today's talk is not a lecture about diagnosing jealousy. It is not even about fixing a relationship. It is about something far more unsettling. The moment when love quietly transforms into a system of control, and you don't notice it happening. This message is for a very specific group of people, not those who are casually curious about psychology, but those who are exhausted, those who have spent months, sometimes years, explaining themselves, proving themselves, restraining themselves, only to feel that none of it was ever enough. If that sounds familiar, then let me speak directly to you. This is for those who told themselves, maybe if I try just a little harder, things will stabilize. For those who held on to hope, thinking, this time the apology felt real. Maybe now it will change. And most importantly, for those who have slowly begun to doubt their own perception of reality. This is not a conversation about blame, and it is not emotional comfort disguised as insight. What we are examining today is structure, because obsessive jealousy is not an isolated behavior. It is not a temporary emotional reaction. It is a system. And if you fail to understand the system, you will inevitably misdiagnose yourself as the problem. Many people in these relationships ask the same questions. Would things have been different if I had been more transparent? If I had explained myself more calmly, more thoroughly? If I had been perfect, would the suspicion have stopped? These are logical questions, but they are built on a flawed assumption. So today we ask a more fundamental one. Does suspicion actually end when it is satisfied? Most people believe that suspicion is caused by a lack of information. They assume that if enough clarity is provided, peace will follow. More explanation, more understanding, more trust. That's the equation. But philosophically speaking, this model is deeply inaccurate. Suspicion, in its pathological form, is not a response to missing information. It is a response to internal instability. It does not originate from the outside world. It is generated and sustained within. And here we encounter an insight echoed in ancient philosophy, including texts like the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It suggests something profoundly counterintuitive. Fear does not feed on reality. It feeds on attachment. This is crucial because in obsessive jealousy, suspicion does not grow because of what you did. It grows because the structure itself requires it, which means no amount of explanation can dismantle it. At best, explanation functions like a sedative, temporarily reducing anxiety. But the system remains intact. This is where many relationships begin to distort, because what appears on the surface as love, concern, or emotional sensitivity is in fact a mechanism of anxiety regulation. Let's define this clearly. Love, in its authentic form, is built on freedom. It assumes trust. It allows uncertainty to exist without collapsing. But obsessive jealousy operates differently. It is built on control. It requires constant verification. It treats uncertainty not as a natural condition of human connection, but as a threat that must be eliminated. These two systems are fundamentally incompatible. They cannot coexist. So we arrive at a critical question. Why does the jealous partner never reach complete reassurance? Why does verification never end? Why do apologies fail to create lasting change? And why does control, ironically, intensify the very anxiety it is meant to reduce? To answer this, we must look deeper into the internal architecture of obsessive jealousy. At its core, the issue is not distrust of the partner. It is distrust of the self. The jealous individual is not simply someone who doubts you. They are someone who cannot stabilize their own sense of worth, their own desirability, their own security within the relationship. This creates a persistent underlying fear. I could be abandoned at any moment. And that fear does not require evidence. It operates independently of reality, which is why even after reassurance, a new question inevitably emerges. Yes, but what about next time? This is not a linear problem. It is a feedback loop. Each act of reassurance strengthens the system. Each act of control reinforces dependency. Each apology resets the cycle without breaking it. In fact, the mechanism closely resembles addiction. Relief becomes temporary. Tolerance builds. What once required a small confirmation now requires something more intense, more access, more control, more submission, and gradually something deeply paradoxical occurs. Compliance becomes evidence of guilt. The more you explain, the more it seems like you're hiding something. The more transparent you become, the more it suggests that you're compensating. This is the cruelty of the system. There is no winning move. Now let's address something rarely spoken out loud. The deepest fear in obsessive jealousy is almost never expressed directly. You will not hear, "I'm afraid I'm not enough. I'm terrified you will leave me." Instead, you will hear, "Your behavior is suspicious. This situation doesn't make sense. You can't trust people these days. Do you see what's happening?" The internal fear is being externalized. And once the problem is projected outward, it becomes unsolvable because you cannot fix what is not actually there. At this point, many individuals try one final strategy: perfection. They respond instantly. They reduce social interactions. They expose every detail of their lives. But even this fails, because within the system, perfection is reinterpreted. If you're this careful, maybe you just become better at hiding. This is the moment where the structure reveals its true nature. It is not seeking truth. It is preserving itself. So what then is the cost? The cost is subtle but devastating. The relationship ceases to be a space of mutual growth. It becomes a device for managing anxiety. You are no longer a partner. You are a regulator, a stabilizer, a constant source of reassurance. And in that process, something essential is lost: your autonomy. Let me be precise. The purpose of this analysis is not to tell you what to do. Whether you stay or leave is a personal decision. But that decision must be made with clarity, not hope, not guilt, not illusion. Because the moment you understand the structure, you are freed from a very specific trap: the belief that this is happening because you are not enough. So as we move forward in this series, we will not focus on isolated incidents. We will focus on patterns, not emotions, but mechanisms. And we will continue with one essential question: why does obsessive jealousy never reach resolution? Because once you answer that, everything else becomes unmistakably clear. If this perspective helped you see something you couldn't name before, consider subscribing and share, not for growth, but so that more people can recognize the difference between love and control disguised as love. So we left off with a critical realization that leaving this kind of relationship is not an act of strength, but the collapse of a certain way of interpreting reality. It is not that love disappears. It is that explanation stops working. And once that happens, something deeper begins to shift. The fourth turning point, shared by those who eventually break free, is when endurance itself is no longer seen as virtue, but as danger. Up until that moment, endurance is framed as maturity. You tell yourself, if I stay calm, I'm being responsible. If I tolerate this, I'm being patient. If I absorb this, I'm being strong. But then something fractures. And for the first time, you begin to reinterpret your own behavior. Endurance is not growth. Endurance is not strategy. Endurance is self-erasure. And then a question emerges, quiet but irreversible. If I keep enduring this, what kind of person will I become? This is not a rhetorical question. It is an existential one, because the moment you become afraid of your own answer, the relationship has already lost its foundation. The fifth turning point follows naturally. It is when the outside perspective, once dismissed as intrusion, becomes a mirror. Before this shift, external voices feel irrelevant. You might think they don't understand the complexity. They're oversimplifying our relationship. They're being too extreme. But after the shift, something unsettling happens. You begin to see what you couldn't see before, and the interpretation changes. I wasn't seeing clearly because I had become used to it. This is the moment when perception returns. Not new information, but restored clarity. At this point, it is useful to introduce a philosophical distinction. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, there is a powerful idea. Letting go is not loss. It is the act of returning what was wrongly held back to its proper place. From this perspective, leaving such a relationship is not a failure of love. It is a correction of attachment. It is not escape. It is the breaking of a cycle. And what happens after that break? Interestingly, those who leave often say similar things. Not dramatic statements, but quiet, almost disorienting observations. I don't have to explain anymore. I don't feel constantly anxious. I can breathe. These are simple sentences, but their meaning is profound. I am allowed to trust my own perception again. So let's summarize this phase clearly. Leaving is not about willpower. It is about a shift in responsibility. Apologies and good memories lose their authority as evidence. And endurance, once admired, reveals itself as a form of risk. But now we arrive at a more complex question. What happens after the relationship ends? Because here is the uncomfortable truth. The relationship may end, but the structure does not disappear immediately. Many people expect relief, and yet what they experience is something far more confusing. They say things like, "I'm free now, but I still feel anxious. No one is questioning me, but I keep explaining myself. I feel like I'm still being watched even when I'm alone." This is not attachment. It is not longing. It is residual structure, because this kind of relationship does not just affect emotions. It rewires behavior. The first and most common after effect is what we might call compulsive explanation. In the relationship, explanation was not optional. It was survival. If you didn't explain, suspicion followed. If suspicion followed, escalation was inevitable. So your system adapted. And now, even in safety, the pattern remains. You explain before being asked. You justify even trivial actions. You try to eliminate any possible misunderstanding. This is not personality. This is conditioning. The second after effect is even more paradoxical. You become uncomfortable with peace. In the relationship, tension was the baseline. You were always anticipating a question, an accusation, an emotional shift. So your nervous system learned something very specific. Tension means I am prepared. Silence means something is wrong. Now imagine this. For the first time, nothing happens. No conflict, no interrogation, no emotional volatility. And instead of relief, you feel uneasy. Why is it so quiet? Am I missing something? Is something about to go wrong? This is not irrational. It is neurological. Your system has mistaken chaos for order. There is a useful analogy here. Imagine someone who spent years in an environment where unpredictability was constant, like a harsh training camp. If one day nothing happens, no punishment, no disruption, that silence becomes unsettling. Not because silence is dangerous, but because it is unfamiliar. The same applies here. You are not reacting to reality. You are reacting to the absence of what used to define it. Psychologically, this is known as chronic hyperarousal, a state in which the nervous system remains activated, even after the threat is gone. Philosophically, it aligns again with the idea from the Tibetan Book of the dead. That consciousness, even when freed, tends to return to what is most familiar, not because it is better, but because it is known. The third after effect appears in future relationships. Over-verification. You become hyper-aware. You analyze tone. You scrutinize behavior. You anticipate patterns. On one level, this is protection, but beyond a certain point, it becomes another form of confinement. Because now, instead of being controlled by someone else, you are controlled by your own vigilance. So what is the core injury here? It is not simply damaged self-esteem. It is something more fundamental. The collapse of self-trust. You begin to question, was my perception accurate? Were my standards too weak? Did I cause this somehow? And unless this is addressed, the relationship continues internally. Which brings us to the starting point of recovery. It is not forgiveness. It is not understanding. It is a single, stabilizing recognition. My discomfort in that situation was valid. Without this, recovery turns into self-blame. With this, reality begins to reassemble. The next step is rebuilding standards, not for judging others, but for protecting yourself. You begin to ask, do I feel safe in this relationship? Am I respected without having to explain? Who is responsible for the anxiety present here? These questions are not philosophical. They are structural. And once again, philosophy gives us a final lens. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, there is a line that reframes everything. Liberation is not in the next life. It is in recognizing the illusion right now. Recovery is not about erasing the past. It is about seeing clearly what remains and releasing it. So let's conclude this part with precision. The relationship may end, but its structure lingers. The anxiety, the explanations, the doubt, these are not signs of weakness. They are learned survival responses. The real work of recovery is not becoming stronger. It is becoming clearer. And that leaves us with one final question. What does a fully recovered person actually look like? Are they unshakable? Emotionless? Immune to doubt? Or is the transformation something far more subtle? That is what we will explore in the next lecture. Not how people become stronger, but how they become less destabilized. If this helped you reclaim even a small part of your perception, consider subscribing and share. Because for many people, the difference between staying trapped and waking up is not time, it's understanding.